Why do some families grow wealthier from generation to generation, while others lose everything within a few years? The issue isn't money, it's mindset, which either gets passed down or disappears. I once said, if you want to leave your children something more valuable than assets, leave them your philosophy. In this video, I'll explain how to do that and show you a practical model you can start applying today. Let's start with a simple but uncomfortable question. How long will your wealth last after you're gone? The statistics are unforgiving. 70% of inheritance is gone by the second generation and 90% by the third. Most children of wealthy parents don't know how to manage money because no one taught them to think like the wealthy. Most heirs don't lose money. They lose the connection to the principles that created that money. And that is the real tragedy. I remember once at a seminar, a man came up to me and said, "My father was wealthy, and I'm barely making ends meet. What's the difference?" I replied, "Maybe your father passed on money, but not the map of how he earned it." That's what we're talking about today. How to create not just wealth, but a culture of wealth in your family. Not just to leave an inheritance, but to build a system so your children and grandchildren don't have to start from scratch. Because true wealth isn't numbers in a bank. It's a mindset, a philosophy, habits that become a family tradition. And that's exactly how Jim Rohn thought. A financial legacy, as I've often said, is not a bundle of cash in an envelope. It's not the assets that can be lost in a second divorce or a failed business. True legacy is a mindset that creates wealth regardless of circumstances. And the first thing to realize is this: what you pass on to your children doesn't begin with a will, and it begins with your habits right now. People often ask me, "Jim, where does the system of financial wisdom start?" And I answer with example. Children don't remember your lectures, but they absorb your lifestyle. If you don't keep a budget, neither will they. If you only save when there's something left over, they'll do the same. If you don't invest, they'll be afraid of investments. But the opposite is also true. If you have a clear system, if you demonstrate discipline, responsibility, respect for work, that imprints on them deeper than DNA. I believed in this not just as a philosopher. I saw how it works in practice. One of my clients, a farmer from Kansas, once shared a story with me. He began keeping a financial journal where he logged his expenses, income, investments every month, just for himself. A few years later, his 14-year-old son started doing the same. No pressure. You know what happened? By the time he was 20, the boy had his first investment portfolio. Not because his dad forced him, but because his dad showed him. Children don't do what you say, they do what you do. And if you want to build a financial legacy system, start with yourself. Jim Rohn didn't grow up with silver spoons. I was born on a farm in Idaho. My first understanding of money was simple. You either have it or you don't. But everything changed when I met Earl Schoaf. He told me, "Jim, don't work for money. Work harder on yourself than you do on your job. The money will come." And you know, he was right. That became the first principle of my system. Personal growth is the first investment. If you want your kids to be wealthy, teach them not to chase money, but to grow themselves. Because money is a byproduct of value. Want more income? Become more valuable. Want your son to know how to earn? Teach him to read books, build skills, face challenges. Wealth starts not with stocks, but with character. The second principle, discipline in small things. I've never met truly wealthy people who weren't disciplined. I'm not talking about big steps. I'm talking about the daily habit of saving 10% no matter the income, about the habit of paying yourself first, about the ability to track finances, because you can't pass on what you don't control. I once spoke in Texas, and afterward a young woman came up to me. She said, "Jim, I'm trying to teach my daughter to save, but we're living paycheck to paycheck." I said, "Then why not start with your own example?" We often want to pass on wisdom without changing ourselves, but that doesn't work. If you want your family to be wealthy, you must become the root of that culture. You don't need to be perfect, you need to be intentional. I had no financial education, but I started tracking my finances. I started reading books. I learned to value invested money more than spent money. And over time, this became my philosophy. It's better to teach a person how to create wealth than to simply give it to them. One of my favorite examples is families that create financial councils. Once a month, they gather and talk about the budget, goals, investments. Imagine that, not arguments about spending, but constructive conversations about preserving and growing wealth. That is culture. That is a system. And you can create it yourself. Start small. Even a family piggy bank is a beginning. You know, I love to repeat a simple phrase. Money is not just a resource. It's a test of whether we can think long-term, because short-term thinking wants everything now. but true financial wisdom thinks generations ahead. I thought about that when I created my library of audio programs. I knew not all my children would become entrepreneurs, but I wanted them to think like people capable of creating value. That is my legacy. That is the system I passed on. So if you want to grow a true financial tree that bears fruit for your grandchildren, don't start with a will. Start with an evening conversation, with a book you read together, with an example you set tomorrow. Because a legacy system isn't a document, it's a way of life that endures even when you're gone. If you've ever attended one of my seminars, you know I believe in the power of personal transformation more than in lucky circumstances. And when we talk about passing on financial wisdom, transformation is exactly what must happen. Not just in the parent, but in the child. You can't just hand and heir a portfolio of stocks and expect they'll know how to manage it. You first have to instill in their mind the understanding that this is a tool, not a trophy. And I saw this firsthand. I often shared how at 25, I was in debt and completely broken. I had a child, a wife, a pile of unpaid bills, and no plan. I had no inheritance, no system. And when I attended Earl Shof's talk, I wasn't looking for a philosophy of legacy. I was looking for a lifeline. But you know what he gave me? A mindset that transforms generations. And a few years later, when I was in a position to help others, I realized my real responsibility wasn't just to earn, but to become a transmitter. Not a hoarder, but a guide. And that's the second level of legacy. You don't just leave behind wealth, you build a culture of transmission. Imagine your children not only know how to count money, they know how to create it. They're not afraid of the market. They understand the power of long-term investments, the power of habits, the power of reputation. They think in terms of value, not instant gratification. And all this is possible if you begin investing not in their future, but in their philosophy today. I've seen many moments in life where financial philosophy changed families. One man I mentored began giving his children a weekly salary, not just for doing something, but for creating something. One had to draw a plan for saving up for a bike. Another had to come up with a way to earn money outside of school. Over time, their home had a goals board, a financial tracker, even a small family fund where everyone had a stake. It wasn't millions, but it was a system. That's legacy in action. And I want you to understand one thing. Wealth is not just about numbers. It's about the quality of thinking. I once said, the best thing you can do for the poor is not become one of them. And I stand by that. You won't help your children by overprotecting them. But you will change their lives by teaching them to be independent, strong, resilient, disciplined. You may not pass on everything, but you can pass on the most important thing, the belief that they can create everything themselves. I've had the privilege of mentoring thousands who later became millionaires. And do you know what they had in common? Not education, not starting capital, but the decision to live by a system. They built a mindset. They wrote down goals. They acted with purpose. And many of them then taught their kids. One of my students, who achieved financial freedom by 40, created a family tradition. Every year, each family member gives a short financial presentation. What they learned, what they did, what they discovered. Imagine how that changes children. They're not afraid to talk about money. They understand wealth isn't taboo. It's responsibility. People often tell me, but what if my kids don't want to listen? What if they're not interested? And I always respond, your job isn't to force them. Your job is to live in a way they can't ignore. I never made my kids become entrepreneurs, but I showed them what self-discipline looks like. I showed them what it means to work on yourself. I didn't lecture them. I lived my philosophy. And believe me, that bears fruit. One young man approached me after a talk and said, Jim, I started listening to your audio programs with my son on the way to school. After a few weeks, he asked if we could create our own action fund. I didn't know what to say, but then I told him, that's the real result. You're already building legacy. Sometimes it looks modest, but that's how big things begin. The philosophy of wealth transmission is not about fear of loss. It's about belief in continuation. If you live with the mindset, I must control everything, you're not building a system, you're building dependence. But if you live in a way that your wisdom can live without you, then you're leaving a true mark. My mentor, Earl Shof, didn't leave me money. He left me direction. And everything I have grew from his vision. How many more people has he never met, yet they were changed by what he passed on to me? That's influence. That's legacy. So ask yourself now, what will remain of you 20 years from now? Will your children speak about finances with respect and courage? Will they guide their children into the world with a sense of value, not just expense? Will they know how to create, not just consume? If not, don't worry, because today you can start building a different future. One of the most powerful ideas I've ever come to understand is that true legacy doesn't begin when you die. It begins the moment your life starts influencing others without your direct involvement. And that's where the third level of Jim Rohn's system comes in, the living legacy. It's not what sits in a safe, it's what lives in the minds of those who were close to you. I remember once speaking to an audience in Los Angeles, and after the event, a man approached me. He said, "I don't remember everything you said, Jim, but I remember how I felt. That was the first time I believed I could change my financial future." And you know what? 10 years later, he was holding seminars himself, helping others, mentoring young people. I didn't leave him an inheritance, but my philosophy took root in him. And now, he's a bearer of that idea. That's what I call a system. You build a structure that exists without you because you invested yourself into others. It's like a tree that bears fruit long after you've planted it. If you raise children who know how to earn, think strategically, and make decisions without fear, that's success. But if they also teach those principles to their own children, business partners, and friends, and that's legacy. Many people fear death not because of dying itself, but because of the feeling that nothing will remain. But I tell you, you can leave more than a house or a bank account. You can leave behind principles. You can leave a structure of thinking. You can leave a vision. Once I asked a student, "What would you want your son to know after you're gone?" He said, "I want him to know that fear is not a reason to retreat, that discipline isn't a restriction, it's freedom, and that money is the result of value." I said, "Then start passing that on today, or not with words, but with your life." I remember when I first heard the idea of moral capital. It came from an old businessman in Arizona. He said, "Jim, I'm not as worried about my investment portfolio as I am about the portfolio of ideas I'll leave behind." And I realized the most important capital isn't financial, it's mental. If we leave our kids money without mindset, they may lose everything. But if we leave them mindset, even without money, they can build everything from scratch. That's not just a nice phrase. It's backed by history. I came from poverty. I know what it's like to start without capital, without connections, without guarantees. And I know what changes a life, the decision to become a person who doesn't live by circumstances, but by principles. And I pass those principles on through seminars, through books, through audio programs, but most of all, through my own way of life. And now I see those who listened to me 20 to 30 years ago are now teaching their own grandchildren. That is a system. That is a living legacy. Someone once asked me, "Jim, what's the point of success if there's no one to share it with?" And I said, "Success without transmission is just a story, but success that becomes a system, that's a story with a sequel." That's why I believe the highest level of wealth is when your life becomes a source for others. Not through charity, but through the power of example. Imagine this. Your family has a code of financial wisdom, not a legal document, but a set of principles you live by and pass down. Always save 10%. Always invest in growth. Always tell the truth in business. Always seek long-term value. You can't imagine how much this shapes children. They don't grow up in a fog. They grow up with direction. We can't avoid all crises, but we can teach how to respond to them. And that might be the most powerful thing you can do for your heirs. Leave them with an inner compass, because money depreciates. Businesses change. But the principles that worked for me in 1970 still work today. Respect. Responsibility, living within your means, understanding the value of time, investing in knowledge, self-discipline. These are universal currencies. So if today you ask yourself, what will I leave behind? Don't think only of material things. Think of the lessons, the stories, the habits you can pass on. Because your true power isn't in having created wealth. It's in having created the mindset that creates it again and again. That is the legacy system. That is the Jim Rohn path. And now, it can become your path too. So my friend, let me now speak to you not just as a viewer, but as both an heir and a creator. Everything we've talked about, it's not philosophy for the sake of sounding wise. These are practical things. But they won't work if you just watch the video to the end and go back to living the same old way. Wisdom isn't passed on passively. It's passed through action, through example, through decisions. And that means it's time to act and to start with yourself. I want you to pause for a moment right now and look at yourself from the outside. Truly look. Not from the perspective of your job, your salary, or your status, but from the perspective of influence. What exactly are you passing on to your children, if you have any? What are you passing on to those who see you, hear you, take you as an example? Because even if you're not a parent yet, you are already influencing. And your habits, they are already part of someone's story. Let's try a brief self-assessment. On a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 means I completely ignore this, and 10 means I act consistently and systematically, rate yourself in the following 5 areas. First, how regularly do you save money from each income? Second, how clearly do you understand the financial principles you want to pass on to the next generation? Third, how disciplined are you in tracking, at least basic, expenses, income, investments? Fourth, how actively do you create opportunities for open conversations about money within your family? Fifth, how much is your personal life an example to follow in terms of finances and values? Right now, give yourself these ratings. Not for anyone else, for you. And look, which one is the lowest? That's your growth zone. That's the starting point for your weekly action plan. Not everything at once, just one. If you're not saving, start with $5. If you're not tracking, start with one column. If you're not talking to your kids about money, start with one story from your childhood. Because progress isn't in the size, it's in the decision. I know it's easy to say, I'll start Monday. But Jim Rohn said, later is a trap, tomorrow is a trap. There are only two choices. Either you live by principles or by excuses. So I urge you, take a sheet of paper, write down your ratings, pick your weakest area and write, I will work on this for the next 7 days, and begin. No drama, no perfectionism, just begin. And one more thing, share. In the comments under this video, write which question was the hardest for you and what first step you'll take. This isn't just about engagement, it's about the power of community. Because someone, seeing your comment, might also take their first step. And that's the living system. That's legacy in action. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because the next video might be the very moment that changes not only your story, but your family's story too. And if you want this philosophy to live on, hit like, send this to someone who needs it, and leave a comment. Because wisdom doesn't live in words, it lives in movement, in shared movement. And so to close, I'll leave you with one simple truth that once changed my life. Don't seek ease, seek strength. Because when you are strong, everything becomes easier. If you want to pass on wealth, become a source of strength. If you want to leave behind more than things, live in such a way that your mindset takes root in others. That is true legacy. That is the Jim Rohn system. You can be the first in your family to build a culture of financial wisdom. You can be the one remembered not as the one who earned, but as the one who taught. And believe me, that is more valuable, because money can vanish. But wisdom, it lives through generations. Choose strength. Choose the path that leaves a mark. Choose not just accumulation, but transmission. And then your life will become part of a story that continues long after you've finished your journey.